There's a really big gap that exists between First Nations people here in Australia and the newcomers or the guests that come to this land.
And so when we fight for higher standards in prisons, that also shapes and affects the way in which we process migrants in this country.
The right visa subclass and the right visa in general is your token to how much privilege you have.
There's really ignorance sometimes in saying that ancient wisdom, that needs to be thrown away.
The takeaway is that we're taking the strength from each other.
I think I started the crying session. We're healing.
Interview one, take one.
My name is Dina Yako, and I am an Assyrian Indigenous woman from the lands of Bet Nahran. Shlami Ukhubbi, love and peace upon you all. Welcome to you all on this roundtable discussion on what I believe to be a very important discussion, where often the voices of those who really matter are missing. I'd like to quickly introduce the participants that are joining us here today. We have Sadiqa, Atena, and we have Tyson and Abang. I'd also like to begin by paying my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands we now call home, their elders past and present. We recognise the resilience and strength of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and we honour their connection to the lands, water and sky. Some of us here have come from afar, seeking shelter, safety or new beginnings. For some, it was our ancestors who made the challenging journeys to Australia. We carry our birthplaces and homelands in our hearts and find comfort in being welcomed by those who have inhabited these lands for over 60,000 years, whose sovereignty remains unbroken. As we walk on these lands, we promise to care for country, which continues to care for us. I am a survivor of genocide, my ancestors have been, and I haven't been able to even track down, where my great-grandparents are from, because that history is no longer, it doesn't exist. So part of me is always feeling really empowered to make a difference here, because I can't do it back home, because I'm not given the ability or the space or the safety to do so. But at the same time, there's a really big gap that exists between First Nations people here in Australia and the newcomers or the guests that come to this land. We are disinformed from the beginning, because when we are learning our civic education program, and I know that as a teenager who came to Australia and studied in the education system, the Australian education system, there was hardly any mention of the truth about what really happened with Indigenous communities here in Australia. And, I really recognise so many similarities, and the struggles were the same, and we had so much in common, and yet that whole conversation was missing in the whole process of my resettlement. I have also often asked myself, what are my responsibilities as a newcomer? Tyson, you are a Nyamal man, and you have dedicated your life to using story to inform and enrich the lives of everyday Australians and perhaps others around the globe. What is it like to be a Nyamal man, and how have you helped shape the narrative when it comes to First Nations people's experiences in Australia?
Being a Nyamal man means here on Wurundjeri country, I'm off country. Nyamal country is in the Pilbara in Western Australia, so I'm very far away from my traditional lands. My grandmother was the first daughter of Min Paringu, one of the important Nyamal ancestors and elders who my grandmother was then stolen from. She was taken down to the Moiriva native settlement in Magumba. If you've seen the Rabbit Proof Fence or you've heard of that text, it's the exact same place. And that sort of began our history as a separated Nyamal line, people that grew up off country. Thankfully, we've been able to reconnect and rejoin our family and participate fully in native title rights that have changed in the last 5 years. But nonetheless, country's a really tough part of Australia. It's not the same as here in Melbourne. It's one of the driest parts of Australia. It's also home to the largest iron port in the Southern Hemisphere by tonnage. So the land in Nyamal country has felt some of the most severe land degradation and destruction you can imagine under colonialism. And so I actually moved here going on 12 years ago, and this has been the absolute privilege of my life to be able to live here off country and not only gain access to a tremendous education, but be part of a fantastic, vibrant, sovereign, culturally powerful, but really beyond anything else, inclusive and welcoming community. The Wurundjeri here on Naarm, along with the Bunurong, along with other Kulin nations, all used these lands as a sanctuary for thousands of years. And so if people feel like there is something special about this place or feel welcome or at home, it's because that's what this place has been designed for millennia. When we walk around the great city in the northern suburbs, they were swampy marshlands that were curated specifically for thousands and thousands of animals to live in a natural habitat. And the Wurundjeri would live alongside the banks of the Birrarung, curating one of the final destinations for the eels that would travel through country along the waterways and heading out of the Birrarung into what is Port Phillip Bay now. And so together, along with the other Kulin nations, they would hold Tanderrum and welcome 5 different nations onto Wurundjeri land to conduct ceremony, to trade knowledge and goods, and to enjoy plentiful food. And so when we think about what it means to be Indigenous and what it means to be Nyamal, what it means to be on country, it means to be under the laws of the Wurundjeri. And what you mentioned earlier about looking after country and respect for country is a big part of the Wurundjeri ask and what they ask us to do as guests.
Now over to you, Sadiqa. You arrived in Australia after enduring many years of uncertainty. Years of being forcibly displaced from your ancestral homeland, Afghanistan, due to war and conflict. I'd like you to briefly tell us what the experience was like for you and your family.
When I left the country, I was only 2 years old. I have a very little memory of Jalguri, where I was born. And luckily I have my grandma who passed all the stories about Hazara people. Unfortunately, Hazara people, despite their very colorful culture, they have been facing a lot of marginalization, discrimination, ongoing genocide. But luckily, my grandmother kept the memories and everything alive. When we left the country, Dina, when you ask me about how it feels, like it is a storm of emotion. It's like you're leaving behind a very big part of your identity. You're 2 years old, you know nothing about like the place you were born, and it's not just that your journey is ending there. The displacement continued because of the dark history Afghanistan is going through. When I tell the story, I keep telling people that I'm talking about my pieces, the pieces I left behind in every country. Whenever I think about that phase, all the phases before finding our safety in Australia, it is that it gives me a feeling of, oh my God, I'm carrying a lot of truth in me. I'm carrying a lot of stories. I'm carrying a lot of shared struggles that we can have with First Nation people that needs to be talk about. It needs to be shared. And I'm very glad that this conversation is happening today here.
So moving over to you, Etena. Your experiences of being displaced from your homeland, Iran, and then enduring some of the most known dangerous journeys across the sea, arriving in Australia as a young person seeking asylum, and then having to face almost 10 years of living in limbo, with nowhere to go and nowhere to return to. I'd like to get to know more about your experience living here in Australia and what that has been like.
My family and I migrated to Australia in 2013. When we migrated, we felt very welcomed in. But throughout the years, with the policies that were in place, it didn't feel like it was as welcoming as we had hoped. It was a terrible 11 years of living in this constant limbo, of wondering, are we going to be able to stay? Having this constant, every 6 months of calling immigration and asking them to renew our visa to see, are we going to be able to stay? After living in Australia for 10 years, in 2023, when I started university, I was told that I'm not allowed to study. After another whole year of enduring that pain and finally telling my parents about it, They then took away our work rights. It was a terrible 3 months of being in that constant fear of, where does the income come from? How are we meant to live? How are we meant to survive? Having to go back to that survival fear of being in that flight or fight instinct. Eventually though, we were able to receive our PR. We got our permanent residency. And for once, after those 11 years, it felt like I was finally welcomed. Although we had been living, working, studying, and even opening our own restaurant, everything felt normal, but deep down I knew that we weren't welcome. I knew that with one piece of paper, we would have to go back to a country that didn't want us.
Thank you, Atena. Abang, your story began in the shadows of war. At 5 years old, you were separated from your family during the brutal civil conflicts in Sudan and Ethiopia. You became a child refugee, navigating 6 regions, surviving displacement, violence, illness, and heartbreak. Can you share a bit more about your pathway to so-called Australia? And how has displacement shaped your relationship to identity and belonging?
Thank you so much, Dina, for the question. And I really relate with all of you expressing your journeys. And I stand in solidarity with not just the Nyamal people, but First Nations people. I remember my father, before he was persecuted and killed in Sudan, he told me a lot about the flow and the river, because we are a river people. And he told me that it's so important whenever you go and step into someone's land to ask for their blessings, because you don't just walk in and disrespect. And so I was really conflicted when I arrived in Australia as a refugee, because of course I know that this land is First Nations land. And so I wanted to find ways to contribute, you know, and not only look after myself, but look after the earth and, you know, what blessings I'm receiving from this land. And so in finding identity and belonging, in answering your question, it is an ongoing journey. And I find that our problems and trauma doesn't just disappear, but we can negotiate with it. And, you know, my way of dealing with finding identity is through my visualization, which I call buckets of hope. And that's something that I have introduced into my teaching. And teaching across Australia in remote country like Mount Isa. So I've had the opportunity to also be able to travel across Australia and be able to live with First Nations people to understand firsthand what their experiences are. And I don't think I can be able to understand everything, but I think it's an ongoing education and it's an ongoing dialogue. So I'm very happy that I'm part of this conversation, and thank you for the opportunity, and thank you, Tyson, for sharing.
This kind of conversation between displaced peoples, that also includes refugees, people seeking asylum, is rare in Australia and globally. Why do you think that is?
I think the most obvious, and it's, I think, the most straightforward answer is underrepresentation and racism. Because I think when you understand the history of Australia, the patterns of our migration, who was coming here when, and what relations were like between new peoples, there's a lot more diversity and a lot more interesting stories in there than what's represented in not only the education system, but in the imagination of Australian nationhood. My grandmother, she was stolen because her father was Japanese and her mother was Aboriginal. Interracial marriage was restricted between non-whites. Everyone that was coming into this country that wasn't coming in off the back of the Americans or the British were being segregated because of race and mixing with First Nations people. And the relationships were really, really good. It was a really positive, welcoming, typically well-involved community because people were responding against the discrimination they were facing in the colony. You weren't allowed to be black, you weren't allowed to be Asian, you weren't allowed to be brown, you weren't allowed to speak anything other than English and participate. It made them illegal to exist. And so, by rule of that, people had to make their own spaces and negotiate and deal with each other directly rather than having to include the police or include the state, and it was better. So yeah, I think it's mostly about racism.
And why do you think it is actually important for us to be having these conversations?
Well, yeah, this type of conversation, it's very rare globally, and it's very important. Why? Because we are coming from the backgrounds, from the experiences that we have shared struggles. We have shared stories. We have shared a grief, the things that we've lost, our identities that we've lost. It was not that it was our choice, but how it was taken away from us. That's important to have. And it's not just about the shared struggles, it's also the strength and hope, resilience we have. If we talk people from Afghanistan, Hazara people living in Afghanistan, intergenerational, from ancestors, we have been facing discrimination, genocide, being removed from the fabric of the community, from society, from books, anyway. There are a lot of things that we share in common. That's why this sort of conversation, they're very important. And it's also important, I know, like, while it's important, it's very uncomfortable. There are a lot of, like, we need to go through a very long journey to at least make this sort of conversation a comfortable one. Not a comfortable one, but something that people can have, start willing to at least listen to these stories, start willing to change their perspective.
A lot of the times there are a lot of negative misconceptions around people seeking asylum, refugees. But I want to challenge some of the misconceptions that refugee communities have about First Nations people. Because often we have been stripped from who we are and our identity, because that's been part of the process of our journey. Because we've had to tell our story in a certain way. We've had to write our story a certain way so that it would be acceptable in the standards of the immigration system. So how do you think Western or settler narratives have erased or distorted Indigenous and displaced people's stories?
We have a really infamous Australian image, right, that has been exported around the world, but it's also an image of whiteness. Absolutely. And when you ask people overseas what the quintessential Australian is or what they look like, they're going to come back with some Crocodile Dundee knockoff variety. If you live in any one of our big cities, if you live in any part of the regions, the reality is Australia is not predominantly white. All the different suburbs and the amazing food and culture and arts and everything that we do lives and breathes is not just about whiteness. But that is the story that gets told again and again and again, and is the one that takes center stage. That's a lot to do with our politics and a lot to do with the ways in which Australia has been controlled and managed throughout history. The White Australia policy being one of the most, infamous examples of that. And that was because they wanted to maintain this as a British colony. That's why misrepresentation and dog whistling and discriminatory politics is part of the playbook, is because people are self-interested and have a reason to lie, have a reason to misrepresent, and have a reason to stoke fear.
I think what we often hear is that all these examples of things that happen in other countries around the world, but what we fail to talk about and recognise is the systemic discrimination that occurs in Australia. We know that racism exists. Barriers for First Nations people exist. Barriers for access exist to all refugees and people seeking asylum. Ateno, how do you relate to the concept of multiculturalism? And often what we see is that service providers using the term very easily, you know, and the term is often used to indicate that they are working with diverse communities. But is it really doing harm by bundling everyone in the same box? Because often multiculturalism is referred to people that come from different backgrounds. But I know that in many cases, and for people who are seeking asylum, that diverse difference is about your visa subclass, and that could determine what services you get and how much of a service you can access and whether you are being discriminated against systemically. So if you don't mind, like just to elaborate a little bit more on that, you know, have you ever experienced, you know, that impact of, you know, being diverse, but not necessarily from a cultural perspective, but because you don't hold the right visa subclass?
Yeah. The right visa subclass and the right visa in general is your token to how much privilege you have and how much access to resources you really get. In 2024, when my family lost our work rights, we had no income. So we couldn't get any income. We had just lost our jobs. We reached out to these massive organizations that were saying that they are here for asylum seekers and that they're here to help. But when they would look deeper into what visa class we had, then it was, well, we actually can't help you. It physically won't let us enter it into the system. And these massive organizations that are there very actively talking about how asylum seekers, we're going to help them, and in terms of rent and food and housing, they were not there. Their gates were closed. It was the community members that were helping us. Go back to your country is what we were met with.
Tyson, how have you navigated the racism and barriers within Australia as an Indigenous First Nations person?
The way I've navigated growing up, getting an education and making a life here in Australia is really shaped by my parents' experience. Our way of doing things as the Clark family, or as my dad's side of the family, we're all fighters. We're all loud, outspoken, stubborn, hold our ground sort of people. That also means that there's been a lot of fights. I remember being grade 4 and having the teacher explain that Captain Cook discovered Australia. And I think nearly every black kid in the country's had to deal with that moment in some way in the classroom and deal with that lie. And for me, it was to stop the class and correct a record in front of everybody. Now, for a lot of the time, people don't feel the comfortability or the strength or the knowledge that it's okay, that you can do that. But I could do that because my parents backed me in 100%. And they knew that I was speaking the truth. And my dad would, at any opportunity, make sure that I understood what the truth was. And that it wasn't just a matter of being able to move past it and slide by or let things go. No, in fact, that it's your actual duty, your responsibility to correct the record. Because if they erase you in this way and you let the lie be maintained, you participate in your own demise. You enable the lies that they speak about you to become true in people's minds.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think story and self-representation and self-determination, it comes in all shapes and sizes. I think by starting from family, educating our children, but most importantly, being the voice that's perhaps missing in some communities. Abang, I want to just ask you, as an educator, how have you challenged racism in your classroom?
Yeah, so just like Tyson, I am very big on education, and I think the biggest education was for my students to see that they're being taught by a black woman. Some of the places I've taught at, they've never had a black teacher, and I was the first teacher. So it was a huge responsibility and an enormous challenge, you know, to change their preconceived ideas of what a black woman or a black person represents. A lot of the students say to me that they've learned a lot, and that's when I started sharing my voice, because I thought that my story needed justification, that I needed to have an education before I can tell anyone, because then it would not be legitimized, and people would say, "What do you know?" Because of my refugee journey, I had huge gaps in education itself. I arrived in Australia with less than 6 years formal schooling, and then I had to navigate this big higher education. But then when I became a teacher and having master's degree, I thought, maybe now people can listen to me and say, oh, you know what, she has a master's degree, and then I can share the story with my students. But then, of course, how ridiculous, because now that I've shared the visuals and the story, people want to know about it. So the way I look at things is I ask myself, what can I actually do to help this situation? I don't wait for someone else. We don't need permission to express our story, to tell our story, to educate. And we don't need a PhD either, although it's great to be able to do a PhD. But yeah, that's what I do now. I learn. I'm a very big learner. I learn every day. And I think that is the way to bridge the gap, through that education and through creating awareness and storytelling.
It is our duty, our responsibility to keep educating people on different challenges that refugees have. And also with education, Dina, it doesn't have to always come through like the degrees that we mentioned. Like it's also like the very small, like let's say you're going in within the community, talking to them, and you're creating that wave of willingness that people need to learn more. People need to educate themselves what's going on beyond their neighborhood, beyond their house, beyond, like, let's say their comfort zone, their council, the council they're living in, what's happening around the globe, what's happening with different people who are living in the same neighborhood with them.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you see colonization and imperialism continuing to shape migration today? And how do you respond when people say that this has nothing to do with us here in Australia?
This might get heavy for a minute, but if you think about Australia's position and place with respect to the military-industrial complex and intelligence apparatus that the United States operates and uses the world to surveil, police and inflict violence, between conflict and between climate change, these are the two biggest drivers of forced displacement and migration and people needing to seek refuge. Australia has a series of really significant military spy bases spread around different parts of the country. This whole side of the world around the Indian Ocean is effectively surveilled because of Australia's capacity to maintain the satellite connections. And so when people say this is really about the rest of the world, well, no, Australia is enabling drone strikes, bombing, is directly responsible for supporting Israel and their defence efforts as well. So yeah, I think anyone that says that is naive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've seen it happen in a lot of the conversation around the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, where everyone kind of, thought that they were going to find the weapons of mass destruction that they're still looking for, by the way. And I think that really shaped some of the conversation that happened because people weren't naive anymore. And I really like what you said about, we can't continue to play that card of not knowing. Just because we're a little bit far from the rest of the world, it doesn't impact us.
It's that farness is what they're interested in.
Yes.
Because there is not another part of the world that was colonised so late and that had so much geopolitical and technological impact for the Americans as Australia. And that's why we've been the closest military supporter of them since the Second World War. Absolutely. Every single fight that they've picked around the world, Australia has had to be second in.
Absolutely.
And I think if this country is going to mature, if this country is going to grow up, and I think this is where all of the guests that have arrived in this country have a say and have a stake in, is decolonising this country. Because the longer we are a colony, the longer we are going to be participating in creating new genocides. And as a victim of genocide, as someone that has had their family removed, as someone who's on this country now and can see a better way to do things in Australia, with the richness of people that have come here with these experiences, that's what I see unites us, is a better way forward.
I think this actually leads us to the next really important conversation, which is about honouring truth-telling. Why is honouring truth-telling important? And both for ourselves but also for the wider community.
Truth telling is so deep. It's such a deep topic because, especially for my family, when we came to Australia, there were parts of me that I felt like I had to leave behind. And for so long, I think I tried to black out that part of it because it was easier to just move on. But the more you suppress that, the more you try to hide that, the more hurt you get in the future. My parents talk about the journey. They share that experience. They make jokes about it. We laugh about it because jokes and harmony and storytelling is what unites us.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess for me, honouring truth-telling is about the truth being honoured, and there is such a big connection because often we haven't been given the platform to tell our truth, and we're not honoured if we're seeking permission to tell our story. We have survived centuries and thousands of years and generations, and the only method of survival has been our stories and our truth, and honouring those stories and continuing to tell those stories.
There's two ways we can think about this. We can think about this from like who we are as humans and what we are, and story is really just song formalized. So it's really just our most ancient, primordial way of encoding knowledge. And we've come up with so many different ways of improving the way in which we retell that through printing and writing, into film, into podcasts, into vines and reels and YouTube shorts. All of these things are just new versions of doing the same thing, and that is trying to get a point across. What we've seen in the last few years, and has culminated very recently in the release of the Yurok report, has been a massive wave of truth-telling, led by First Nations people speaking on their own histories. It is one of the most important, I think, nation-building activities that Victoria has done in recent history. Because if we take the lessons and the recommendations learnt from here, this is not just an opportunity to better things for First Nations Australians. This is an opportunity to better things for all Victorians and everyone that calls Naarm and the surrounding lands home. And so when we fight for higher standards in prisons, and when we fight to deprivatise prisons and make sure that people that take these roles and take these people's lives into their hands are publicly accountable, that also shapes and affects the way in which we process migrants in this country. The same company that is responsible for running some of the private prisons, or used to run the private prisons in WA, and we're also, responsible and part of the more broad prison system, are the same companies that operated Nauru, Christmas Island, Manus Island. And so when you go through the Yurok, I want you to think and look at the recommendations and understand that if this rule applied to all of us, would we live in a better society? If we could guarantee this right to self-determination, self-representation, right to language, right to practice culture, right to live a peaceful, harmonious life, while also not needing to strip back parts of ourselves or render invisible the things that make us so special, I think we live in a better society. All of these things are rights that we should all have. First Nations people are always going to stand on those rights because we are the custodians here, and we are the people that ultimately need to maintain this country and keep everyone on it accountable.
What does real solidarity and belonging look like when we use our collective power to navigate complex systemic flaws which have disadvantaged First Nations people?
I think when people really listen and focus on what First Nations people are saying is that they want freedom and they want love, they want respect, and they want to be able to live their lives. And I think people can relate to that. And I think my hope is that it can be a home for everyone, for anyone that's lost their home. For me, having lost and been separated from my homelands for generations now, this is the privilege of a lifetime to be able to live in this sanctuary with so many different people from all parts of the world sharing in this common space. And I think any way that we can band together and try and transcend the typical violence of nation states, the better. And the only way we can do that is by standing together and refusing to play by the same rules that have built prisons, that have started wars, and, you know, is trying to arm the world.
I always remember this African proverb that says, if you think you're too small to make an impact, try sleeping with a mosquito. And, you know, so that has really reminded me of my own place in the world. So I think this is the first step. That's what I would do, starting small, listening to everyone, giving space, and ensuring that we're not, as a result of our own pain, trying to inflict further pain to other people.
Yeah, it is. For that, the asks are very simple. It's not that big ask of a very immediate change, a very sudden change that need to happen. It's more of like being very careful that the same history pattern do not repeat again and again, not only for First Nation people, but with any people who are coming here from diverse background, calling Australia home.
What does it mean to be in a space like this together?
This is a really special space because I think it's representative of the special place we're in. And for a lot of people, coming to Naarm, coming to Melbourne is life-changing because, like I mentioned earlier at the start, this has been a sanctuary for the Wurundjeri, Wurrung, for the Kulin Nations for millennia. And being able to share stories, share knowledge, trade in information and grow in power because of that is what this place is for. And so being able to honour that history and honour that legacy now by bringing more people along on that journey and maintaining that tradition of sacred knowledge and truth-telling on this country is really special. And for me, being able to participate in that way on Wurundjeri country, having been off country, I think is something that we can share in, no matter what country we come from.
Of course. I guess for me, it's about healing. I think the healing process has been such a long journey for many of us. And I think this is about putting my trust in the hands of the First Nations people of Australia, because I have lost that connection to my homeland. But I think that by being connected to First Nations people, we're healing. I just need tissues, please. I think I started the crying session. Okay, we'll take a breather, yeah? Yeah. Wow. Honestly, like, I did not think that this was going to get to, like, I didn't think we were going to dig in this deep. It's good stuff, and I'm really happy that it's happening. I think it's the first time for me to get to sit and talk to someone from here on such a deep level. I've always wondered what it would be like, and it's honestly been, I think, one of the best experiences.
Yeah, and you know, like this there's really like ignorance sometimes in saying that ancient wisdom needs to be thrown away and that we need to now be a new way. And there is power. There is real power in when we listen to our First Nation people who have this immense wisdom, the profound connection they have with land and nature is something that we all have something to learn from. And I think just having that knowledge pass on and sharing it is very important, not only for ourselves, but it's important. This is what we need. For me, I think it's a living library. I used to say to my schools that we need elders, we need people to come in and actually pass on knowledge, you know. The curriculum and what we're just ticking the boxes in most cases is not really what is going to transform the next and future generations. You know, modernity has brought some benefits, obviously, and we've inherited quite a lot of the benefits, but there's also some damage and things that has happened. And how can we balance, how could we bring old knowledge with new knowledge and bring it together? And the way we could do it is not by ignoring this wisdom that has been here for the past 60,000 and more years. And that's what we are feeling, and that's what you're feeling right
Absolutely.
now. It is quite great, you know.
Absolutely.
We're in a land that is sacred.
So big.
We're listening and we're talking about this, and it's real.
Absolutely, no doubt about it. And I think that's been, the case for many of us. I know from my community, we've been displaced so many times that we've lost that connection to our land. And the more we look at it historically, you know, the cultural erasure is existing. You know, the more artifacts they dig and they find, but then they're in a region where, you know, people are there and they're rewriting history. So even that is no longer a connection for me. And I'm just hoping that, you know, that my story will be remembered one day, and that I heal through my storytelling and honouring that truth. But most importantly, I want to be able to give more to the people here, because I am part of this land now, and I am part of the sea and the sky, and I really want to be honouring and continuing to honour the legacies and the stories of First Nations people in Australia. And I feel that we're privileged to be here, but then with that privilege also comes responsibility. So I think for me, that's what I will take out of this today, is about the fact that this is only the beginning.
The very strong thing about First Nation people in the communities that we're coming from is that strong bonding of, like, no matter what, like, we will be there to support each other. It also, Dina, starts from, I forgot the name of that dance, like Assyrian people do. Like they put their hands, what was the name?
Yeah, we hold
hand together.
We call it khidga, which is,
yes.
we hold hands when we dance.
In that one, that's
we do.
That's the story. Like that shows the unity and how, like, things are going to, you know, that it's transferred from generation to other generation. From us, it's also a group dance. Everything is done in a group. So that's the strength. And this storytelling is like, this storytelling is a way of healing for both of us in this sort of conversation, is that when we're talking together, the emotional moment that you had, the, like, learnings we had from each other, it's like when we're going back home, it will be the takeaway is that we're taking the strength from each other. We're becoming each other's hope. And the more this type of conversation goes on, it increases. So this is like, it is a way of, like, a great way of healing through talking. And a great space to have.
I love that. I love that. if you could leave people with one truth or call to action after watching this, what would it be?
I think there's so many things that makes us so different, but finding that unity, like refugees and asylum seekers uniting with First Nations and having this conversation where it's two very different stories, but having that come together and how those journeys and those resilient pathways are connecting, it's so important. So help a neighbour, go out in your community, firmly put your boots on the floor. Just because it doesn't affect you doesn't mean that it's not affecting others. Just be present.
Yes, be present. Abang?
For me, I think it's the same. Our voices, our stories matter, and we do leave ripple effects that manifest, and it becomes, this part of the Australian fabric. And I have been given space, I have been given privilege, and now I want to sit down and also listen to different communities, listen to First Nations, and just be there and to hold space for people.
Absolutely. Tyson?
Protect country, protect water, protect the young ones. And as ancestors, our descendants deserve the truth. And I hope we have the humility to listen as we learn those stories and pass them on.
Yeah, absolutely. Sadiqa?
For me, Tina, one thing that I will leave, it will be like a very simple one. Have the willing that you need to listen to those stories. It's very simple. It's that you need to change your perspective. There are different angles you can see a picture, you can see a story. Think more, think beyond what's impacting your life personally, and also what's happening, going on to your next door neighbor.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess for me is about education. It's about educating yourself and others. It's about advocacy, advocating for change, and it's about service. Go out there and do the work that needs to be done. And I think we've come to the end. Do I need to make any closing remarks? No? Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our discussion today, and believe it or not, she is human, she cries. Today has really been one of the hardest conversations I've had, but I guess the most rewarding experience of my whole time that I've been in this country. And I thank you for making this happen. I thank Tyson for taking the time and really educating us, but also embracing us with your knowledge. And I am absolutely, gobsmacked, speechless, which is never the case. I'm still talking, but I am speechless. This has been absolutely one of the best experiences of my life, living on this country. So thank you guys.